Hi and welcome back to another winter line and wash painting. I'm going to keep it nice and simple, but sort of keeping it a little bit brighter. I'm going to use some pastel colours in the sky and the snow, sort of just giving that winter look, sort of the distant promise of spring, because of course us living with winter at the moment, we're just longing for the spring now, for some colour and some life. So today I'm using my Saunders Waterford cold pressed 100% cotton paper, and I'm starting off by drawing in a simplified pencil drawing using the photograph that I have got for reference, a royalty-free photograph from Pixabay, and it's just depicts this simple little village, I suppose, with winter trees and a few buildings and just a very plain field of snow, keeping it nice and simple, just blocking in the basic shapes of the buildings and the trees with pencil. While I'm keeping it simple, I'm still working on making sure that I get my positioning of my buildings and my proportions of my buildings and trees just about right, so that I can then use it as a guide and go over it with my waterproof fine liners in order to build up my outline, my line, in other words, the line part of the line and wash, and my darkest darks. So that's what I'm working on now. The pencil that I used was a carpenter's pencil that I bought from a do-it-yourself shop. The sort of pencil that's used for marking up measurements on wood. It's a nice large lead, and it stops me from fiddling. It means that I can draw loosely, and if my drawing is loose, my line work should be loose, and then hopefully the painting will stay nice and loose. With line and wash, you're creating your darkest darks, your main contrast with the white of the paper against the black line of my fine liners. Today I'm going to be using mostly my Pigma Microns. I'm going to be using the size 5 for most of these lines, for the finer lines, for the outlining. But then to quickly get in the shading, I've moved back to my Faber Castell Artist Pitt pens that are filled with Indian ink. And I tried my brush pen, but it's run out. So I'm using a sort of an ordinary, it's like a felt tip nib, but it's 1.5 millimeters. It's nice and thick. You can see it's giving me those nice, strong darks. So anyway, going back to that, with line and wash, we work in 3 main tones. The white of the paper for our lightest lights, the fine liners for our darkest darks, and then when we come to paint, all we need to do is use mid-tones, and I'm going to be keeping it incredibly simple, the painting part today. So once you get your pencil sketch right, then go over it carefully with your ink pens, making sure you block in some nice contrasting areas, keeping it nice and simple. And you can see that even though I'm using very, very simple pen strokes and scribbles, it's beginning to shape up, and it's beginning to look like a reasonably realistic little village scene. You can use any fine liners for these as long as they're waterproof. But you can, of course, do the line work last if you plan it carefully, if you plan your washes carefully. If you don't have waterproof fine liners, you can paint the painting first, maybe sketch it in pencil so that you can see where you're going with your wash. And then once your washes are completely dry, you can go in with your non-waterproof fine liners and do the line work afterwards. There's no rules with this sort of thing. Like most painting, you can put the line in first or you can put the line in later. And of course, you can always go back in when you've finished your wash and add any more line work that you might feel the painting needs for a little bit more balance. So there's a lot of flexibility in this technique, and I think that's what makes it so fun, but also so effective. So I'm nearly finished working across this skyline. Because I'm right-handed, I've worked from left to right, more or less this time. Just makes it sort of a little bit more easy. I'm trying not to cover anything up with my hand as I draw so that you can see what I'm doing. I always use the thickest pen possible, a little bit like when I'm painting. I use the biggest brush possible to achieve the effect that I want. That keeps me loose. That's one of the sort of tricks to staying loose, I think, is to use the largest implement possible, because then it stops you from getting too fussy and too fiddly. It's like when I did my pencil drawing, I used the carpenter's pencil, which has a very thick lead. And when I paint, I use large Harkey brushes or large calligraphy brushes, that sort of thing. And it stops me from fiddling, as I say, so that I can hopefully keep the painting looking nice and fresh. So back to the Pigma Micron. After putting in some of the thicker tree trunks and branches, now putting in the finer branches with a 0.5 nib. The line work in a line and wash often takes quite a while, but it's because it's doing nearly all the work in the painting. Just about everything is carried by the line work, so getting that right is really important. And then it's just a matter of a few splashes of colour, and hopefully that pulls the painting together. And of course, if you prefer just to keep this as an ink drawing, then that's absolutely fine as well. You can do this on a smoother paper. It doesn't have to be done on waterproof paper or with a waterproof fine liner. But this sort of thing, you can really get a lot of satisfaction from producing these kind of very high contrast ink drawings. I think Faber Castell Pitt pens also have a range of sepia pens. I think I might try and get hold of some of them, because I'm pretty sure they're still waterproof, but I think maybe it might be quite interesting to use that sort of like rich sepia brown as a base for a line and wash, rather than using the standard black. So watch this space and let me know if you think that would be interesting to see a sepia line and wash. I'm making sure that I get some nice sort of contrast across the base of the buildings and where the trees are. So I've got a few different planes, even though we're looking up this slight rise to the village. There's still a little bit of distance being indicated by the tree lines sort of at the very back. So I'm just trying to make sure that I get that in. And then the final detail will be putting in a slightly closer fence. And then just a few marks in the snow just to give us a little bit of interest in the foreground, although the foreground, ideally, because the foreground is not the focal point in this painting, the midground is, ideally we want the eye of the viewer just to skip over the foreground and focus on the buildings and the trees, because that's our focal point. once the line work is finished, then I always leave it, even though it's just these pens that dry quickly. I always leave it for about 5 or 10 minutes to make sure any thicker areas of pen are fully dry, because when it's still damp, the pen can smudge. It becomes waterproof when it's completely dry. So I'm going to roughly wet my page. I'm not too bothered about it being evenly saturated, because I'm just going for these very loose washes of paint. And I'm going to be using cerulean blue, sweeping it across the top of the sky, leaving some patches of unpainted paper, and those will be my clouds. Now I'm putting a bit of the blue across the snow, quite simply to just add that little bit of reflection, because the snow will always reflect what's going on in the sky. This is rose madder. It will dry a lot lighter than that, but I will lighten it back a little bit more by just cleaning my brush, making sure it's not too wet, and then just diluting that pink paint a little bit, putting some pink across the snow too. So I think that's nearly done. I just want to put a little bit of variety across the village and the trees without overdoing it, just a little bit of colour. So I'm going to dab in a bit of indigo for the distance. Everything's still wet, so it's just diffusing softly, but I'm making sure that my indigo isn't too wet, otherwise if it's wetter than the paper I will end up with nasty marks and cauliflowers. So I'm making sure that my mixture is slightly richer than that I used for the sky mixture. And now I'm going to go on with some raw sienna here and there, just to add a little bit of brightness, bit of interest to the village and the trees. This is using my small 3/4 inch synthetic flat brush, which is really useful just for very loosely dabbing in this sort of detail. And again, I'll bring some of that across the snow as well. So I suppose this painting is really using 3 primary colours. We've got cerulean blue, rose madder and raw sienna. So now that I've roughly painted it, I still think it looks effective, and as you can see, I've been avoiding my rooftops that are covered in snow to keep them nice and white. And now that it's dry, I'm looking at my line work in places, and I think I need to go over and darken up some of my building gable ends. They're very dark in the reference photograph that I used from Pixabay, but I tried to keep some of them a little bit lighter for some interest. But now that the paint's on, I don't think it works. So I do think I'm going to block those in with my fine liner just to finish that off. I think that just adds to this kind of continuity. There's a sort of a linkage of the darks across the focal point, so your eye doesn't stop and start. The eye just sort of moves smoothly, looking at the buildings, the snowy roofs and the trees. So that's it, I'm finished now. So I'm going to remove the masking tape. This is such a simple painting, certainly suitable for beginners. Intermediates can probably make it a bit more complex if they want to, by maybe being a bit more painterly or adding more detail to the line work. But it's really one that anybody could have a go at. So I do hope that you'll give it a go. It's amazing how effective such simple paintings can be, and that's what makes it satisfying, when you can get good results just from a very simple classic approach. Well, I hope that was helpful. Please leave us a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to my wonderful Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.